sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name's Beth. If you're new, welcome. Today I'm working on a Christmas table runner and it's for a gift. I want to get it finished by next week. I'm bringing you along, but today it seemed I kept making mistakes. I'm going to show you all the mistakes I made and how I solved them. Let's get started. Here are the 3 blocks that I made today. I'm going to show you how to make one, but I made it incorrectly, and this is the first mistake I made. I cut my strips 2.5 inches and I was supposed to cut them 1.5 inches. For my block, each block, I also need some 3-inch squares, green and white, and for the center I'm going to use a 4.5-inch red square with these 2.5-inch squares for the corners to make a square in a square block. After drawing a line on the back of my white square here from corner to corner, I sewed right on that pencil line, and if I open up my square and make that triangle, it should cover that area in the background. So I'm going to cut that away, and this makes a really nice, easy square in a square block. At this point in making my block, I did not realize I had cut the wrong size strips for the design that I was working for. I took a design out of a book. I have a few books with blocks, designs that are just pictures of blocks, and then I go and try to figure out how I'm going to put it together. And this one I began incorrectly, so in just a few minutes I'll show you how I had to go about fixing this mistake. I was still on the wrong track. I cut all of my little 2 patches here 2.5 inches wide, and I will have these to use in a future quilt, and actually I use some of these to make my smaller pieces as I went along, but right now I am cutting everything incorrectly, and I'm sure some of you have been here. The last element for my quilt block today is half square triangles, and I need 4 half square triangles for each of my blocks. So I put my 3-inch squares together, and I'll draw a pencil line from corner to corner, and then I will put a seam on both sides of that pencil line. After making all my half square triangles, I trimmed them all to 2.5 inches. At this point in making my block, I did realize that my little 2 patches were the wrong size for the quilt block that I had been looking at. So I did some deciding. I had to make some decisions. I wasn't sure I wanted to go back and make the correct size for the block. I thought maybe I'll just change the quilt block, make it a different quilt block, but I decided, I really wanted that original design, so I cut my strips 1.5 inches, the correct size for the quilt block that I was aiming for, The quilt block is called Irish chain. There are a lot of quilt blocks called Irish chain. This is just another variation of the Irish chain, or someone gave it this name a long time ago. Quilt names are sort of a mystery to me, how they got the name, and they are in quilt books with labels with the names, and I didn't do a lot of research, but this one is called Irish chain, and there were about 8 to 10 Irish chains in the quilt book that I was looking at. So now I can cut my little squares, my little 2 patches, and I will say that I constructed my block this way first, and there is also a little later in this video another way to construct the block. I will be showing that a little bit later in this video. I was looking at a couple of quilt books with these pictures of quilt blocks, and this is one way that it was diagrammed in one of the books, was to use 2 4 patches in each of those side areas. So that is what I did in my first go round on this block. I arranged my little 4 patches around that center square with the green squares meeting in the center on the outside there, and that's the way to get this design for this particular Irish chain quilt block. I put my block together, and when I was done, I wasn't really satisfied with that center seam on those outside green and white squares there on the side. I thought there might be a better way to go about putting this quilt block together, and since I needed to make 2 more for my table runner, I tried a different tactic on getting my block together. So here I am getting ready to make my second and third quilt blocks, and in just a minute I'll show you how I cut the strips for those outside squares. I have put my 2 1.5-inch strips together, and now I'll make 2 more square in a square blocks for the next two quilt blocks, and I'm using a variety of red prints. I thought that would be fun to make this table runner just a little bit scrappy. Now that I have my 1.5 inch strips together and all the other pieces are ready to go, I'm going to cut my little pieces here. I think it might be just a little bit easier way to put this block together. So I'm cutting a 1.5 inch chunk and then a 2.5 inch piece to avoid that 4 patch that has the seam in the center, the 2 4 patches that have the seam in the center. This center piece will kind of replace the not that it's a big problem, but the issue I had with my first quilt block. So I'm going to make 8 of these little side panels for my quilt block so that I will have enough for the next 2 quilt blocks that I'm making. Now that all my pieces are ready, I can sew my quilt block together. Here are my 3 quilt blocks. I think it's a really pretty block, and I do like the construction of the last one better than that first one that I made. This was all sort of a journey for me. I had not made this block before, and I'm not really happy with those center seams with those 4 patches on the outside area there. Here's the seam that I would like to avoid. So I am going to cut some pieces out of these leftovers here. This is one of those 2 patches that I made early on with the 2.5 inch strip, so I'm going to cut it down so that my little bars or 2 patches, I'm not sure what to call these little elements here, but they are 2.5 inches wide and 2.5 inches with the strip there, 2.5 by 2.5, and I'm going to take my little scissor and pull out those pieces in the center there, and I'm going to replace it with my new little pieces that I made. I'm really happy I decided to rip out those pieces that I didn't care for. It would have been fine if all of the blocks were the same, but since I tried this new way, and I kind of prefer these little strips, 2.5 by 2.5 inch strips, then I'm glad I decided to replace them, and it really didn't take that long, and they fit in there really well since I'm using a 1/4 inch seam. You know, when you use a 1/4 inch seam all the way around, everything should fit together nicely, and this time thankfully it did. I now have my 3 blocks ready to go, and as I told you in the beginning, this was kind of a day of mistakes, and thankfully I think that was the last mistake that I made today. So I'm on to adding some strips between my blocks, and then I'll add a border all the way around. My strips are 1.5 inches, and I needed to use a fabric that's slightly different. I didn't have any more of that background fabric, but I did have this fabric that I think will go along really well with the background on the block. So I'm adding the strips between, and then I'll add a 2.5 inch border all the way around. I will be quilting my table runner very soon, and when I do, I will let you know how I do that. You might have some ideas. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.